So, I don't like criticizing a passion project because it's clearly a personal experience to the filmmaker, but if you drop it into the public eye, you've got to expect divisive response. I have a lot of admiration for Duncan Jones, and as one of his Twitter followers, I see that he's rightfully trying to flood out negative criticism because nobody likes being criticized, and I know that from common experience. But with all due respect to Jones and his vision, Mute is a bit of a mess. Keeping this video quite freeform, it's interesting how Mute echoes a lot of the same criticisms I had with the Cloverfield paradox, and that's without getting into the whole discourse surrounding Netflix and their quality control. I call Paradox direct-to-video schlock, but after watching Mute barely 3 weeks later with a lingering bad taste in my mouth, I'm starting to worry that direct-to-Netflix is the new direct-to-video. Now, unlike Paradox, I don't think Mute is frustratingly bad, but rather just frustratingly dull and disappointing, because I can totally see the passion behind it, but then it becomes drowned out by a vapid and unceremonious story that's embellished with a shallow attempt to mimic the style and philosophical undertones of Blade Runner, but without the self-restraint to just be its own thing. I mean, I think if Jones focused more on just creating his own world than replicating one that already existed, there would have at least been something more remarkable to talk about, because if you stop being blinded by the derivative visual allure of the film, you'll realize that it fundamentally lacks any real substantial world building.
I think what my attempt was to make a film noir, a much more recognizable of like a 70s thriller or something, than a science fiction film. It just happens to take place in a future setting, and almost treat the science fiction elements of it as the location of the film, rather than the reason for it being, reason for it existing as it does.
The beauty of Jones' first film, Moon, was that you could see his influences come across, like 2001: A Space Odyssey, but bar a few noticeable replications, they never dominate his own vision for a unique mystery thriller. The setting, for example, was minimalistic but emotionally significant to the story, because it starts out as a subdued therapeutic environment given Sam Rockwell's character is isolated alone in space for a number of years, and by the end, the environment feels psychologically reflective of a padded cell in a mental institution given Rockwell begins to lose his marbles.
Yeah, you've been up here too long, man. You've lost your marbles.
It was a genuinely inventive way to use a simple setting that never physically changes, but rather emotionally changes with the character, and I find creativity like that missing from Mute because of its dire attempt at constant replication of pre-existing ideas. There's a simplicity to Blade Runner where it takes all the exuberance and vibrancy we associate with color and neon lighting and subverts it into something seemingly overshadowed by dilapidation, corruption, and oppression. There is a tangible and emotionally rich atmosphere to Blade Runner that tells a story that we never see, but is wonderfully implied in a mysteriously captivating way. Mute, on the other hand, seems to completely captivate itself with the idea that just because it's pretty, flashy, and has the illusion of detail, it must be good. It feels like a pretentious gimmick at times as opposed to being rationalized by its story, and it makes for a very visually contrived experience as nothing ever seems to work harmoniously. Mute is incredibly on the nose about its science fiction. It's trying to cram so many ideas into one thing that it just becomes jarring. And while I understand the intent could be related to Leo's unfamiliarity with technology, as a viewer it just comes off as distracting and pointless. Again, Blade Runner is a dystopian cyberpunk world that organically incorporates a very conventional piece of neo-noir detective storytelling. It makes something old and ordinary like noir complement something hyper-stylized, and the result is a film with a uniquely mature, realistic quality to help expand your disbelief. Since Mute tries to mimic that presentation almost a bit shamelessly, I find it to be inadvertently quite aesthetically mundane, because there's very little emotional or intellectually stimulating features to its presentation, bar one specific feature which I'll get to momentarily. The story of a mute bartender searching for his missing girlfriend is, by its own admission, an interesting premise, but it doesn't feel like it uses its setting to tell the story, bar a few very minor and seemingly irrelevant moments that don't especially do much to progress the story. For example, Duke engineers a voice box for Leo at the end of the film so that he can apologize for killing his close friend and colleague Cactus, but it doesn't add anything to the story nor develop the characters beyond what we already know of them. Now, that being said, there is one interesting feature to the film that could have been more profound had it been given more focus. I really liked Leo's Amish background contrasting with the setting. I know I criticized the lack of harmony to the world, but there's something alluded to here that sounds ridiculous on paper, but oddly finds a way of fitting in thematically. While I think there is an inconsistency to the use of modern and futuristic environments that feels stylistically contradictory at times, the use of Leo's notebook plays neatly into this idea of a man that's basically too old school and out of touch with the rest of the world to feel part of it. It helps imply a sense of alienation and loneliness and makes such a basic mystery thriller slightly more overwhelming in context to the fact that he knows very little about technology. In essence, his lifestyle provides a personal and symbolic obstacle to his objective, because he can't adequately adjust to the world, which by that account is rather socially relevant given we live in a generation that is absolutely dependent on technology. Moments that contrast technology with ordinary books and utilities very minimally help add some justification to the use of heavy science fiction as if to suggest the death of an old world, but somehow, despite the notebook being used for several plot points, the concept itself still feels creatively underused. I like the contrast between an old decaying world and a hyper-technological one, but like I said, it's inconsistent. In Blade Runner, the old world and the new world naturally and economically synergize. It's not as bluntly segregated as Mute, where the use of two very distinct visual extremities don't feel natural at all. Like when Leo goes to the library, instead of it being super extreme hyper-tech or super extreme old, it just feels conventionally modern and downplayed and thus rather out of place. And then the film calls too much attention to itself with unsubtle and unnecessary visual tricks. Even look at this bowling alley sequence, for example. They use motion tracking to edit together 3 floors, and it's just so visually obnoxious and again, very unnecessary. Do you really need to establish a multi-floored bowling alley? We already know it's a hyper-tech futuristic society. Why can't a bowling alley just be a bowling alley? My point is, it's trying way too hard to be too complex, and it throws out the illusion of detail that it really becomes just too complicated, and there's never a moment where it comes up for air. When I said the film lacks self-restraint, this is precisely it. Showing us all these things isn't world building, it's vapid because it tells us nothing about the world socially, politically, or culturally, and what it does tell us is precisely the same economic imbalance Blade Runner already explored, as did many other science fictions that followed. We get it, high tech is rich and mundane is poor, what a fucking revelation. If it wasn't so overindulgent and sometimes just name-dropping obvious information with dialogue and retained some sort of mystique, it would have felt more distinctly memorable. It shows us way too much, and yet somehow it ultimately feels like so little. But, in a way, the symbiotic challenge of his lifestyle lessens the already existing challenge of him being mute. It just feels like two very specific elaborate problems that are conflicting with each other, but honestly, I'm probably just being pedantic, yet at times it feels like it goes to such an extreme to make him out of place that, again, it just doesn't feel entirely organic. The strange thing about the storytelling is that Paul Rudd's character Cactus is significantly more interesting than any other character in the film. The movie oddly seems like it was written around him, and as a result, his subplot feels like it should be the main plot, and the main plot feels like it should be the subplot. There's just no clear balance between the two storylines, and later on there's this bizarre inclusion of his partner Duke being revealed as a pedophile, and while I realize this didn't work for many people, I actually felt it should have been more of the focus. In other words, Duncan Jones states that this is a movie about parenthood, and that's clear with Cactus's overprotectiveness towards his daughter. And if that was in fact more front and center to the storyline, the pedophile angle could have felt more bold and impactful to a certain degree. This is especially true when Cactus is choking blood because of a knife that's been lodged in his throat by Leo, and he watches helplessly as pedo Duke takes his daughter. It's a genuinely horrifying scene, especially when Paul Rudd's performance, despite having a knife lodged lodged in his throat clearly shows how scared and angry he is, and in a way, if he was given greater sympathetic emphasis, this would have been a significantly more provocative and heartbreaking scene. Paul Rudd's character has several redeeming qualities, but since the film has defined him as the villain and has to forcefully protrude this in several sudden instances, seeing his good side becomes too distorted by a lack of clarity over his character. And that's frustrating when both Paul Rudd and Justin Theroux give by far the most interesting, complex, and emotional performances, but the writing limits what they can add to their characters, which again already rings true for Skarsgård.
So the second that you do something, or the second that I think that you're even thinking about doing something, I am going to break your fucking arms. From your shoulders, all the way down to your fingernails.
Jesus, spill.
Got it?
What the?
Got it?
Yes,
Got it?
Yes, yes. I will. I will try.
When I found myself strangely more invested in the villain, I started to wonder if the film was playing on this deliberate idea of irony and miscommunication, given both Leo and Cactus share the same sentiment of being out of place in this world. But because I was fighting with all these questions that drew me out of the experience, it really highlighted my main problem with the film. It feels more conceptual than executable. In other words, it's just really underdeveloped and not ready to be a final film. It feels like an early draft as opposed to a polished screenplay, and given that this has been in development hell for a significant amount of time, I get the feeling that in the time between the script being conceived and the funding finally coming through, it didn't get much refinement. But of course, that's just my wild theory, so don't read into that. Although Mute has one substantial positive, and that's Clint Mansell's score. It actually helps drive a lot of the film's emotional scenes, and if you read into how Mansell drew from Berlin culture where the film is set, and all the other films Mute derives from, you'll see how he uses these inspirations to build an engaging and relatively original composition, not just fucking lift things from other movies. If Mute is subtextually about parenthood as Jones uses it to pay tribute, I find that his personal approach is rather lost in translation, because while there are several interesting elements that almost kinda work independently, nothing feels cohesive enough for it to be entirely clear what it's trying to present. Mute really is one of those odd anomalies. I can definitely read into it and see where Jones is coming from, but intrinsically, it's a missed opportunity for a unique and exciting world that could have been further heightened by a thought-provoking narrative. What Mute becomes is a film that makes more sense over multiple viewings, but because all of this information isn't coherently presented the first time round, the fact that I had to hunt for a lot of this info doesn't make it any better or more complex as a result. It bites off more than it can chew, and while I can definitely admire a certain level of ambition behind it, I can't help but feel like I would have been significantly more forgiving if it wasn't so obsessed with presenting a world that simply isn't its own. And for those curious about the references to Moon's epilogue, it just made me wish I was watching that court case instead. I mean, multiple Sam Rockwells? Now that's a movie.